Cuphead's back again. What a short wait, it felt like it was only 7 months or something. But I obviously had to cover this, especially after the first Cuphead video I made, so let me take you back to E3 of 2018. Xbox was up to the plate, and this time I was actually in attendance, imagine that. After hitting us with multiple great games, this was a pretty good E3, Mr. Xbox was gonna blow my mind this time. A DLC for Cuphead. Oh my god, new character, bosses, charms, weapons, and a release date? That's hilarious! Yeah, I knew how Cuphead went, and I wasn't buying that 2019 release date, and sure enough, yeah, we're a bit of a ways past 2019. Also, remember when Xbox revealed the game at E3 and it had the console launch exclusive splash screen before the game was revealed? I mean, if the only console you own is an Xbox, it's still true. However, between the game and the release of the DLC, we got a new Cuphead cartoon on Netflix earlier this year. Figured I'd slide this in here since I don't have enough to say for a full video, but it's fun Looney Tunes-esque shenanigans, with the same charm as the game itself. I like how a lot of the characters from the games are recontextualized for certain episodes, and I especially love what they did with the Devil and King Dice here. Easily two of my favorite characters from the show. I heard some people were disappointed that the show wasn't more like the game, since each episode is mostly disconnected from each other and just has the Cup Bros doing random shit, and I mean, guys, what plot would they take from the game? What do you mean? The game plot is just, we sold our souls to the devil through gambling and now we need to get contracts. Okay, we got the contracts, now die. Either way, if you haven't watched it and you're a fan of the games, definitely check it out. There's a lot of cool story-based shows out there, but sometimes you just want some junk food, and the Cuphead show is some really good junk food. Season 2 actually came out around when I was making this video, so I encourage you to watch it, and now's a better time than ever. Next, before we dive into the game, I want to rectify one of my biggest regrets in my videos so far. I did not praise the animation in Cuphead nearly the amount it deserves. I mean, come on, Past Hyper, only one tiny paragraph at the end of the script? That's a punishable offense. So, keeping up the trend of me buying video game reading material, I got my hands on the Cuphead art book recently and only drove home how much of a mistake I had made. First order of business, this book gave me a giant appreciation for the backgrounds. They can be so complex, and yet they don't make the critical boss information get lost in the shuffle, which also goes for how interactable objects in the map stand out from other buildings. It's really cool how they make these things pop. And if you want to talk to me about impressive backgrounds, oh my god, dude, the background for Pyramid Peril actually had me speechless looking at the behind the scenes for it. Molded, sculpted, filled with sand and shit, and even photographed. All that effort for a fight's small background detail that most won't even think twice about. If that doesn't drive home the effort and dedication that the team had to the aesthetic, then I honestly don't know what will. One of my other favorite backgrounds that I always liked was the one for Ribby and Croaks. They fleshed out this nightclub with patrons, people on stage, employees serving food. It looks great. Speaking of dedication to the aesthetic, they really wanted to replicate the style from the era with the wacky and creative transformations characters go through with boss phases. Some of my favorites was the devil's skeleton jumping out of his skin to transition to phase 2, Wally Warble's being shot out of his birdhouse and when you fight him again he's being carried by doctors, Goopy Lagrande being crushed by his gravestone and you having to fight it, and Ribby and Croaks morphing together into a slot machine. They really took notes on this, and it genuinely feels like a playable 30s cartoon, and just this time with 100% less racial insensitivity. I think it's also cool to see in-development drawings of both phases and attacks. I love when you can see the different ways that an attack was planned to be delivered and how they eventually expanded on the ideas. Baroness von Bonbon, which I'm now realizing is a very fun name to say, went through multiple ideas for the projectile in her final phase, with my favorite one being her taking her cone hat and shooting ice cream out of it, before they finally settled on her throwing her head at you. I also really dig some of the alternate designs for these guys, like Werner Werman, who, since he's German, is actually pronounced Werner Vermin, which is an outstanding pun. He used to resemble even more the mouse we all know and love, although he looked a bit more like Mortimer Mouse to me, and then I saw one of their inspirations was Mickey's Rival, the short that Mortimer was introduced in, so yeah, that was probably the idea. There's even times where bosses had completely different ideas, like Rumor Honeybottoms, who had entirely different phases with a completely different boss arena that doesn't even look like it would have scrolled like in the final version. Finally, I just like the little references to other games that really lets you know that the developers are fans of the medium and had a fun time making the game. In the background of Wally Warbles, there's a skull in one of the rocks as a reference to the Wily Castles from Mega Man. The penguins that throw baseballs at you in the final phase of Beppy the Clown are a reference to the Chargin' Chucks from Mario. And of course, the gem from Dr. Cal's robot is a reference to the Chaos Emeralds from Sonic. Now that was a little sizable section there, and I've been talking for a bit and haven't even gotten to the actual subject of the video, but I figured I had to talk about it now because the time I gave to the animation in the original video was an absolute disservice. Either way, delicious last course, that's my segue, work with me. I was extremely excited when this came out, and it released for a minuscule $8. For something of this much quality and care pumped into it, that's actual highway robbery. Before we begin though, I want to throw up a spoiler warning for the entirety of the DLC. This thing's still pretty new, and I know not everyone buys stuff within a couple months of release, so if you're planning on going in blind, then this is your stop. If you want to have my quick thoughts, just know the DLC is really good and you should definitely play it. If you've either already played the game or just don't care, then let's continue on. So what's our story for this little adventure? Well, the Cup Bros are called to this new island by the legendary Chalice. Upon getting there to figure out what the deal is, she offers them a cookie, Mugman eats it, and being the Luigi he is, God punishes him for this transgression. Mugman is dead. Eating the cookie also made Miss Chalice not dead, which is thanks to this new guy, Chef Saltbaker. The cookie was supposed to bring Chalice back to life, but it only works for a little bit and requires the cookie eater to be dead for a couple minutes. However, the chef suggests there's a cure-all for the whole going into the afterlife thing, called the Wondertart. All we need is to beat up some guys to get some ingredients, and then make Chalice finally alive again. So we've got 5 new targets here, a pretty decent amount for what's just an expansion to the pre-existing game. But these guys are going to defend their ingredients with more effort than many were willing to defend their souls. Holy hell, my first 45 minutes of recorded footage was just me bumblefucking around getting kicked into the curb by every single boss I tried. This picks up in difficulty right where the end of the game left off. This is Isle 4 now, where you're more likely to get shit from an army of gnomes than the Lord of Darkness himself. Now, I'm sure this is probably because I've played the original game many times, so I have the patterns of every boss memorized at this point, and now I have to learn new patterns, but you really gotta bring your A-game to these fights, or else you're in for a rough time. Before we stop at bosses though, let's take a look at the shop, because we've got new stock. 3 new weapons and 3 new charms. To start with the weapons, Converge. It's a triple shot that goes through enemies and goes in a shotgun spread when locking your aim. Pretty decent, good damage, and the shots cover a large cone in front of you, which means you can take care of a lot of trouble at once. There's also the Twist Up. At first I thought it was going to be like the air shooter from Mega Man 2, but it's rapid fire and always curves no matter what direction you're looking. I mean, when stuff is above you, it does pretty decent damage, but it'd always just be more effective in my opinion to use the spread shot. And plus, when you aim upward with it, like, come on, what kind of aiming curve is this, dude? But the final new weapon, and in fact one of the best in the game, is the Crack Shot. Flies forward a bit, which is when the projectile is at its strongest, and then zooms to a target while losing some of its damage. In concept, it sounds like the Chaser, a weapon that, if you remember, I didn't exactly like much last time, but there's one big difference between both of them, the damage. The Crack Shot feels like it does a lot more damage than the Chaser, and while it still can have the issue of getting distracted, now since it does more damage, it can usually one-shot the other enemies, and in my experience, it had a bit of a preference for targeting the boss, although that might just be me. It can stand above multiple options in the game, which is pretty broken considering its homing properties. I won't lie, it helped carry me through the expert modes of the bosses to get a little ahead of myself here. One part of me says it's broken and should probably be nerfed a tad, but the other part of me says, goddammit, I love this thing. As for charms, they did the impossible. They finally made a charm that rivals the smoke bombing utility. The Heart Ring. It gives you a heart after your first, third, and sixth parries, and seeing as parrying is a really important mechanic, and that 3 parries is what's required for higher ranks, you'll be at least getting 2 extra hit points on each battle. Couple this with how it doesn't reduce your damage like the other heart charms, and I think it actually surpasses the smoke bomb in the plane levels, since you can get to parryable objects easier and with the smoke bomb not being as helpful in those. There's also the cursed relic charm that you can buy for a whopping 1 coin, but we're not going to talk about that one yet. Also, I find it interesting to note that there's no run and gun stages in the DLC, which isn't a huge loss in my opinion. But if that's the case, where do we get coins to buy stuff? Well, that's where the King's Court comes in. A series of multiple challenges where you beat the bosses only using the parry move, since you can't bring in charms or weapons. You'd think it'd serve only as a method of coin collecting and nothing more, but the fact you have to beat them with parrying exclusively leads to a lot of creative boss designs, not just visually, but from a gameplay aspect as well. I'll try to reel myself back a bit because I'm going to talk about this later, but the fact that all the bosses are chess pieces not only makes it cool to look at, but also really memorable. Either way, I love the encounters with the Rook and the Bishop, which were both standouts from the court's lineup here. After beating each boss, you're given a handful of coins, which I think is actually a more fun way of collecting them than the run and guns, which, despite having more of them, ironically felt more throwaway. This is actually where I used Miss Chalice most, since the dash parrying made a lot of getting and get out hits, and the extra hit point came in handy. Speaking of which, the main highlight of the charms is the Astral Cookie, allowing you to play as Miss Chalice. She has a double jump and parries with her dash, which is a bit weird to start off, but you get used to it. Her main drawback is that obviously since the Astral Cookie is a charm, you can't equip other charms while playing as her. So to make up for the fact that she can't use the smoke bomb, because that's really what this is about, you get to use a roll move that makes you invincible. Pretty neat. On top of that, in the plane stages, her bullets are a triple shot that goes through enemies, kinda like the Converge actually, it's pretty helpful, and instead of shooting out one big bomb for her alternate fire, she shoots out a bunch of tiny bombs. She also has different EX and special attacks in the plane, but I find them to be about as useful as the ones Cuphead and Mugman get. Through my run of the bosses, I mainly play as Cuphead just because that's what I'm used to, but I did use Chalice for expert mode and getting S ranks because she makes it so much easier. They changed the ranking system to where before you needed to take no hits for the health bonus to matter no matter what. Now you just need to have 3 health or above for it to count. Seeing as another one of Chalice's benefits is that she has 4 hearts that lets you take 1 hit and still get an S, which opens up a lot more room for error than you'd think. On top of that, while her EX moves stay the same, her specials are completely different, with the main highlight being her second one. It basically gives her 1 free hit point and it doesn't contribute to the health meter, so you're able to get a lot of extra free hits while still getting the best rank. This makes it easily the best because the other 2 can't compare. The screen nuke she gets with her third is fine, but the vertical laser with the first special makes it pretty awkward to connect it well and not get yourself hit. Chalice is a pretty neat addition. It makes things slightly easier, not by stripping back the bosses, but instead by giving you a minor leg up. It works as a much better easy mode than simple mode, which I forgot to mention last time because it's pointless. You get to fight easier bosses, but you can't get any story progressing items, so why even bother? Playing as Chalice keeps the difficulty of the game intact while still giving struggling players just a bit more help so that they can have a better chance of pulling through. I think this is especially a good addition here because as I alluded to earlier, the bosses aren't pushovers, they'll be pushing you over instead. You know what, why not? We'll cover each of the bosses since there's only a good handful. The first guy I actually managed to take down was Mortimer Freeze, who was the only good use for the twist up I could find, because it actually worked good in hitting him in the first phase. The second phase with the giant snowman was probably the easiest one, you just gotta watch out for when he tries to Silver Sonic you. The giant snowflake mainly is a problem because you gotta watch your footing on the platforms, which makes dodging the projectiles that shoot out of the buckets a major problem. After that, I rammed my head against Glumstone the Giant after I had to go at him 10 times during that 45-minute session of accomplishing nothing. The crack shot is pretty good here since it takes care of the gnomes that love to shoot projectiles that can be a bit hard to notice at times, although the Converge works good too. The second phase is just improvisation central. If you stop moving, the gnomes are going to spawn from under you. If you keep moving, you'll get hit by the ball, and if you try to jump over the ball, you'll get hit by the gnomes in the air. I don't have a strategy for this, you just gotta figure it out. The final phase is actually the easiest, you just gotta make sure the platforms don't die out on you while shooting. The crack shot and spread shot work good here as well. Next up was the Moonshine Mob, and my god, these guys were the bane of my existence for a few hours. The first and second phases I found to be pretty simple, you just gotta keep your eye on a lot of places at once. It was just this Horton Here's a Who looking ass that gave me problems, cause hitting his nose specifically is really difficult to do. I would just use the crack shot, but it likes to home in on the tongue, which unless I'm wrong doesn't do any damage. I found using the lobber worked best since it can bounce off the ground when you're high up enough, which I had no clue about until this. Also, the fake out was cute even if I didn't fall for it. Oh yeah, before doing the next boss, I talked to some people on the island and stumbled across this little puzzle here. Depending on what the guys on the podium tell you, you gotta awaken these ghosts in the correct order. Pretty cool even if I did need to get some online assistance cause I'm dumb. It gives you the option to sleep here, and you can do a lot to me and I won't bat an eye, but as soon as you kill the hourglass guy on the loading screen, you have officially crossed a line. So yeah, there's this hidden angel and devil boss fight, and it's pretty cool. Depending on where you're looking, you'll either phase through the attacks or get hit by them, which I think is a pretty interesting idea, since you're usually moving all over the place in this game, so now you gotta think about it a bit more. That's it though, these guys are more of a mini-boss than anything. You want to do this to basically turn on the cursed relic, but I'm still saving that for later. I will say though, despite there not being much to talk about, this boss was weirdly unnerving. I don't know, that might be weird of me to say, but these guys just feel different. Like, I joked about it already, but when I saw the broken hourglass, I knew I was in for some shit. The music in this feels out of place, not so much in the instrumentation, it's mostly about what you expect, but just in the whole vibe. Even when things got more serious, the music still felt a bit bouncy at least. Plus, the claymation skeleton looks badass, but again, just sorta comes out of nowhere. It doesn't help that when you die, the music keeps on looping even when reloading between deaths. Then you beat the boss, and this time the track that plays is unsettlingly out of place. I feel it hits even more because this is the only time in the game, as far as I'm aware, that they use electronic instruments. Makes it sound like a track out of Luigi's Mansion or something. Wasn't expecting Cuphead to hit me out of nowhere with something like this, but it's cool either way. Sure was one hell of a dream. Next up, the Howling Aces. I am ashamed to say that I didn't know you could move the plane for the first few tries. I'm smart, I swear. The only part of this fight that sticks out is the final phase, which I thought was actually pretty cool. The screen orientation switching was disorienting, but it doesn't mess with your controls, thankfully. Other than that, this was probably the most forgettable out of the new bosses. Not bad by any means, just not as good as the competition. Final boss for me was Esther Winchester, the only plain boss of the DLC, and it gives a nice daily dose of bullet hell. There's a whole lot of attacks going on at once, especially in the first phase, but I think this is one of my favorite examples of how all the attacks are clearly shown to you, so that everything's readable despite how much is going on. I just want to break down the first phase because I love it a lot. There's these two minion guys who can snipe you if you're too preoccupied dodging Esther's attacks, but at the same time the bird flies around in the air a bit before dropping the dynamite and it takes a bit to explode when it hits the ground, giving you plenty of time to notice it's there, and then these little dudes wait until they've flown across the entire screen to shoot off their projectile. To compensate for the fact that you could potentially be dodging both of these at the same time, Esther only has two attacks, one where she shoots ink that roundabouts and then comes back, and one where she lassos a cactus. During this phase of the fight, you could potentially be dealing with 3 attacks coming from different angles at the same time, but the game conveys all the information to you with enough time to understand what's happening, leading it to be very possible and very fun to dodge all of them at the same time. The other phases are done just as well, although the running sausage thing is a real pain in my ass, but I wanted to highlight the first one since it's my favorite. This surprisingly ended up being one of my favorite bosses in the DLC and even the whole game, which I was not expecting from a plain boss since usually I prefer the on-foot stuff. So now that we got all those ingredients, let's go deliver them, shall we? We go to visit Salt Baker and he's accidentally left the door to Hell's Kitchen open. He's planning on baking the soul of your friend into the Wondertart, and I love the attention to detail since if you're going with Miss Chalice, the soul in the jar is the character that Chalice swapped with. So yeah, we get to fight the chef now, who isn't looking as jolly as he was before. Got the devil in his eyes, if you know what I mean. This boss is one of my favorites from the visual and gameplay aspect, while also being hard as balls. I'm gonna break this one down too, cause I love this boss visually. In the background of the first phase, you can see Salt Baker basically murdering all these sentient ingredients, and then he sends them out to go attack you in a seamless transition. On top of that, as soon as the first phase hits, the gimmick of the fight is shown, where the boss hits you with the same level of bullet hell that you get out of a plane stage, which makes for a frantic as hell battle. Oh yeah, also this flame guy is always jumping around here for phases 1 and 2, and he's the bane of my existence. There could be 500 projectiles on screen, and I dodge all of them and get hit by the flame somehow. Next for phase 2, got a Mario reference in there, very nice. Also, the floor of this battle is you just fighting on his hand, which is a cool detail. This phase also has a gimmick that isn't something in any other fight in the game, where you hit these guys and then they fly at Salt Baker and deal damage to him, which doesn't seem like much, but it makes it stand out. Also, the visual of these pepper shakers sneezing projectiles at you is fun and works as a good tell, and I just love the telegraph for the leaf attack of him throwing the leaves in the air in the background. Speaking of good transitions, hot damn, Salt Baker fully shattering and going into the salt realm, that's awesome. Unfortunately, this is probably my least favorite phase, because apart from the fact that it lasts all of 5 seconds, you also only need to dodge the buzzsaw on the floor and these two salty boys jumping around. Maybe another reason I don't care for this phase as much is because this is literally the only spot in either the base game or the DLC where the hitboxes felt a little weird. It might be because prior to this, Cuphead's hitboxes always felt precise to the enemy. Meanwhile, these guys have some empty spots in their posing, but from what it appears, their actual hitboxes is a rectangle that's basically a shape of best fit. It's not great, but again, they die in 5 seconds, so it doesn't matter much. The next phase, though, is really cool in how it reels it back to still being a bit simple, but the fact that it's the last part of the boss, plus the still very present danger, gives the whole thing tension. I mean, you don't want to die at the very last part, yeah? Also, I was wondering while I was fighting him if you could parry off his heart because it's pink, but man, I was too scared to do it. Although I went back and you actually can, so if you feel like making this 10 times more stressful than it needs to be, you know what to do. But after a bit of spamming the crack shot, did they playtest this thing? The heart breaks and we finish this delicious last course. So now we get to save our spirited friend, and Chalice is fine staying a ghost if not being one requires stealing a soul. As for Salt Baker, well, we destroyed his house and by consequence his livelihood and had him incarcerated, because at the end of the day, Salt Baker was just some guy who wanted to trip on that astral shit and we beat his ass for it. It's fine though, he does a little community service and then everyone gets to have a happy ending. So now I'll ask a powerful rhetorical question that confounds many with its broadness. Now what? Well, there's a couple things you can do once the game's over. Firstly, we get to talk about the Cursed Relic now. You can technically do this at any point, but it's not like you're actually going to use the thing, so just do it at the end. After you purchase it, you gotta figure out the puzzle that leads to the Angel and Devil boss fight, which upon beating makes the relic active. So for an accessory that has a mini quest to go on, what amazing things will it do for you? Well, not only does it set your health to 1, but it also randomizes your weapons every time you press the shoot button. Wait, what? Yeah, this thing's pretty special, and not just that, you have to power it up by beating boss fights using it. I thought at first you had to beat bosses specifically in the DLC island with it, which led to me beating 2 bosses there. That was a predicament. I mean, imagine doing the Saltbaker fight with this thing. I couldn't imagine. But no, you can do any bosses you want, so I just got some wins off Isle 1. Weirdly enough, it's not based on the number of bosses you beat, but instead some little point system in the background. There's this little grid I saw for it on the Cuphead wiki, and just saying, beating the Devil or Saltbaker with this thing should power it up instantly, but I digress. After racking up 16 points with it, it's now the Divine Relic. Your weapons still like switching a lot, but now you have full health to start, and constantly have the Smoke Bomb, Whetstone, and Heart Ring active, on top of having your Super Meager fill even faster than the coffee would give you. You get this cool little visual effect, reminds me of when you do super moves in some fighting games. It's an interesting little side grade. The weapon switching thing is a bit too annoying for me, but at least unlike before, the order isn't random, and being able to switch from them at will would be a bit broken, to be fair. The other side quest you can do is getting an alternate costume for Miss Chalice. Beating all the bosses in the game with her gives you this different color palette, and funnily enough I actually did this accidentally when I was going for S ranks, and just didn't know it was in the game because I never talked to the NPC that gives it to you. Oh yeah, I also found this weird Game Jimmy thing, that's a very good pun, and that gives you a hell of a lot more health. I don't think it was in the game prior to the DLC, and either way it's just sort of a weird oddity, but I figured I'd mention it. That's all for gameplay stuff, but I want to go over the presentation of the DLC real quick, because it upholds the same standard of quality from the base game, and in fact, I think it might even be better than the base game. I already talked about it with some of the bosses, but the way they animate for not only conveying personality, but also telegraphing attacks is outstanding. And goddamn, seeing the King's Castle for the first time, how it was an entire clay sculpture that you rotate around for each fight was genuinely stunning, especially since I got to see this after I got that added appreciation for the physical props they used for this game. There is a lot going on in these fights, but the movements and characters are so exaggerated, so distinct, that nothing really gets lost in the shuffle, which just adds to that fair yet still hard as balls difficulty that Cuphead relishes in. It's also cool to see some scrapped ideas get brought back, mainly in the Moonshine Mob. There was this spider enemy that never appeared in the base game, and here he is now. There was an attack pattern that was never used anywhere in the game, and there it is again. And that gets me good as someone who likes looking into scrap content of games. On the topic of presentation, the music is as good as ever, but man, the music for Saltbaker is a really big highlight. There's a new music theme for each of his phases, and they are just amazing. Definitely some of my favorite tracks in the entire game. Ironically, I think the phase that had my favorite theme was the third one, which only made it sting more when you only get to hear it for 5 seconds before you move on to phase 4. Also, they make a new title theme for this DLC, and man, I already like the title jingle, but this new one is a bop. I love this stuff, dude. I won't lie, I loved Cuphead on my revisit I did for that first video, but upon revisiting it for this one, I think it might be one of my favorite games ever. It's got so much shit I love. Simple but engaging gameplay, high difficulty, and incredible art style, fun characters. Oh my lord, it's so good. I am heavily anticipating whatever studio MDHR is cooking up next. I'd love to see another Cuphead adventure, but I feel like they've more than proved they can serve up quality as it is. If you haven't played the DLC, then go play it. If you haven't played the base game, then go play it. If the base game is too hard for you, watch the cartoon. And if you don't feel like watching the cartoon, then go back to Arby's, bitch.